elderly found a canine German Shepherd, freezing, wrapped around a tree. Then she did something sad. The cold was merciless, the kind that steals the warmth from your bones, that turns breath into ice. And in the middle of it all, a canine German Shepherd lay shivering, his body frozen to the ground, weak and abandoned. He had once been strong, fearless, a hero trained to protect and serve. But now he was just another forgotten soul. Someone had left him here, tied up, helpless. And in this freezing world, he had no chance of surviving. But then, she came. An elderly woman, walking through the snow-covered woods, had no idea that this moment would change her life forever. When she saw the dog, his body barely moving, his eyes pleading for help, her heart shattered. And what she did next will break yours too. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful and emotional story. Now, let's begin. The snow crunched softly under Margaret's boots as she walked along the narrow path behind her small cabin. The early morning frost clung to the bare trees, their skeletal branches reaching out toward the gray sky. At 76 years old, Margaret had seen her fair share of brutal winters, but this one felt different. Colder, harsher, emptier. Benny, her little terrier, trotted ahead, his tiny fuzz disappearing into the fresh snow. He always led the way on their morning walks, sniffing out every trace of movement, chasing after the occasional squirrel. But today, something was off. Benny stopped suddenly. His ears perked up, his tiny body stiffening as he let out a low, uneasy growl. Margaret frowned. "What is it, boy?" Then she heard it, a faint, heartbreaking whimper. She turned her head, scanning the forest. Nothing but snow, ice, and the hushed stillness of winter. But Benny knew better. He barked once, then bolted off the path, disappearing between the trees. "Benny!" Margaret's voice wavered as she hurried after him. She wasn't as fast as she used to be, and every step felt heavier than the last. But something in her gut told her this wasn't just an animal in distress. And then she saw it. Her heart nearly stopped. A German Shepherd lay motionless, half buried in the snow, his body wrapped around the base of a tree, as if he had tried to shield himself from the cold. Thick, knotted rope dug into his fur, binding him tightly to the trunk. Margaret gasped. The dog's fur was matted with ice, his breathing shallow. His once powerful body trembled violently, his ribs slightly visible beneath his thick coat. This wasn't just a stray who had wandered too far from home. Someone had done this to him. Margaret felt a sharp sting of anger rise in her chest. Who could do something so cruel? She crouched down carefully, her knees aching from the cold. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, reaching a gloved hand toward the dog. The shepherd's eyes flickered open, dull, exhausted, but filled with something deeper. Fear. His ears twitched, but he didn't move, didn't growl. He was too weak to fight back. Margaret swallowed hard. She had to get him out of here. Her gloved fingers struggled with the rope, but it was frozen solid, locked in place from the ice and tight knots. Frustration built in her chest. She needed something sharp. Digging into her coat pocket, she pulled out an old rusty pocket knife, the one she carried since her husband passed. It had been his once. She had never had a reason to use it, until now. With shaking hands, she began sawing at the rope, her breath coming out in visible puffs. The shepherd let out a soft whimper, his body jerking slightly at the pressure. "Shh. I know, Margaret soothed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm going to help you." It took minutes that felt like hours, but finally, the rope snapped. The dog collapsed into the snow, too weak to move. Margaret didn't hesitate. She pulled off her coat, wrapping it around his freezing body. "Stay with me, boy," she murmured. "You're not dying today." Benny barked excitedly beside them, as if urging them to hurry. Margaret gritted her teeth, steeling herself for the next part. She had to get him back to the cabin. She had no one to call, no family, no close friends, and the nearest veterinary clinic was nearly an hour away. But she couldn't just leave him here. Summoning strength she didn't even know she had, Margaret slid her arms under the shepherd's frail body and lifted. He was heavy, but she didn't let go. One slow step at a time, she carried him through the snow, Benny running ahead, guiding them home. Every breath was harder than the last. Every muscle burned. But Margaret refused to stop. And as she pushed forward, her heart pounding, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about saving him. Somehow, in a way she didn't yet understand, he was going to save her too. Margaret's arms burned as she stumbled through the snow, her breath coming in heavy, uneven gasps. The weight of the German Shepherd was almost too much for her frail frame, but she refused to stop. Not now. Not when he was still alive. Benny darted ahead, barking impatiently as if urging her forward. "Almost there, Margaret panted, her cabin finally coming into view through the thick snowfall. The wooden structure stood small and isolated, a warm glow coming from the window. A safe place. With every agonizing step, Margaret forced herself forward until she reached the front porch. She dropped to her knees, exhaustion finally catching up with her, the frozen dog still wrapped in her coat against her chest. She needed to get him inside, now. With one final burst of strength, she dragged herself up, pushed open the door, and stumbled into the warmth of her home. The sudden heat hit her like a wave, but all she cared about was the dog in her arms. She lowered him carefully onto a thick, old blanket near the fireplace, his limp body barely responding. His breathing was shallow, too slow, his fur still caked with frost. Margaret knelt beside him, her fingers trembling as she checked his pulse against his ribs. It was there, weak but still fighting. "Good boy," she murmured. "You just hang in there." Benny sniffed at the shepherd, his tail wagging cautiously. But when the dog didn't react, Benny whined, nudging him gently with his nose. Margaret felt her chest tighten. She had seen dogs suffer before. She had owned several in her lifetime. But this was different. This dog had been abandoned, left to die in the cold, as if his life meant nothing. Her hands curled into fists. Who could be so cruel? But there was no time for anger now. She had to focus. She grabbed a thick towel and began rubbing the shepherd's fur, trying to work out the ice. His body shuddered under her touch, a weak whimper escaping his throat. Margaret's heart clenched. "It's all right, sweetheart," she whispered. "I know it hurts, but I need you to stay with me, okay?" She hurried to the kitchen, filling a small bowl with lukewarm water, not too hot, not too cold. Rushing back, she dipped a cloth into the bowl and gently wiped his paws, his frozen fur slowly melting beneath her touch. He flinched, but he didn't fight her. Margaret took that as a good sign. For over an hour she worked, drying him, warming him, whispering soft reassurances as she tried to pull him back from the brink. At some point, Benny curled up beside the shepherd, his small body sharing warmth, his eyes filled with quiet concern. Margaret ran a hand through her graying hair, exhaustion pressing down on her. She had done everything she could. Now, all she could do was wait. She exhaled shakily, sitting down beside him, her old rocking chair creaking as she leaned back. Her eyes never left the dog. And as the fire crackled, filling the cabin with its gentle warmth, she found herself talking to him, softly, like a prayer. "You remind me of someone," she murmured, a distant sadness settling in her chest. The shepherd didn't move. Margaret swallowed hard. "I once knew a man like you, strong, brave. And then, one day he was just gone." Her fingers absent-mindedly traced the thin gold chain around her neck, the wedding ring that still hung there, even after all these years. "I think you understand loss," she whispered. "I think that's why you're still fighting." A lump formed in her throat. "I lost him to war," she admitted. "But you lost something too, didn't you?" The shepherd's ears twitched. Margaret's breath hitched. For the first time since she found him, his eyes opened. They were deep brown, filled with exhaustion and pain, but also something else. Recognition. Margaret's heart pounded. Benny barked excitedly, standing up on his tiny legs, wagging his tail like crazy. The shepherd slowly, weakly, lifted his head just a fraction. Margaret let out a shaky laugh, blinking back sudden tears. "There you are," she whispered. The dog blinked, his gaze locked on hers. Alive. Barely, but alive. And in that moment, Margaret knew this fight wasn't over. But neither of them were alone anymore. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She tried, rocking gently in her chair, the fire flickering in front of her. But every time she closed her eyes, she heard his weak breathing, each shallow inhale a painful reminder of how close he had come to death. She glanced at the German shepherd, who now lay curled on the blanket near the fire. His body still trembled, but his breathing had steadied, his chest rising and falling with more strength than before. He had made it through the night. But what now? Margaret had no idea who he belonged to, or if he even had an owner anymore. The thick rope burns on his neck told her the truth. Someone had tied him up and left him to die. But why? Her fingers instinctively reached for the old landline phone on the small wooden table beside her. She should call someone. The sheriff, the local vet, maybe even animal control. But something stopped her. The dog had opened his eyes earlier, had looked at her, and in that moment, she saw something deep, wounded, but trusting. If she handed him over now, where would he go? Would they even try to find out what happened to him? Or would they just send him away to a shelter? She sighed, rubbing her forehead. Maybe she needed more time. A low whimper pulled her out of her thoughts. She turned quickly. The shepherd was trying to move. His front os shifted, his muscles tensing as he struggled to lift his body from the blanket. His back legs shook violently, barely able to hold his weight. No, sweetheart," Margaret said softly, moving to his shin. "You're not ready for that yet." The dog let out a frustrated huff, his head drooping slightly. Margaret couldn't help but smile sadly. He was weak, but he was still fighting. "You're a stubborn one, huh?" she murmured. The shepherd blinked at her. She reached forward, her hand hesitating just inches from his fur. Would he let her touch him? Would he trust her? She slowly lowered her palm onto his thick, matted coat, and when he didn't flinch, she began to stroke gently along his neck. The dog let out a soft, tired sigh, and then, to her surprise, he leaned into her touch. Margaret's throat tightened. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, her fingers gently tracing over the scarred skin beneath his fur. "Who did this to you?" He didn't answer, of course, but his body relaxed just slightly, and for the first time, he didn't look like he was waiting for someone to hurt him again. Benny, her tiny terrier, barked excitedly from the other side of the room, clearly thrilled that the shepherd was finally awake. He pranced forward, sniffing curiously at the bigger dog's voice. The shepherd didn't growl. He didn't tense up. He simply let Benny get close, blinking slowly as if acknowledging him. Margaret exhaled in relief. "Well, at least you're good with other dogs." She stood up carefully, her bones aching after sitting for too long. "I need to get you something to eat," she said, mostly to herself. "Something warm." She moved to the kitchen, grabbing a small pot and some leftover chicken broth she had saved from the night before. It wasn't much, but it would be better than dry kibble for now. As the broth warmed on the stove, a thought struck her. What if he was a retired canine? The way he held himself, the way he had stayed completely silent, his eyes always scanning, always watching. It reminded her of soldiers she had known. Had he belonged to someone? Had he been thrown away after years of service? Her hands gripped the countertop tightly. She had to find out. The broth finished heating, and she carefully poured some into a small bowl before carrying it over to the shepherd. "Here you go, sweetheart," she murmured, setting it down in front of him. "Try to get some strength back." The dog sniffed the bowl cautiously, his ears flicking forward. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, he began to drink. Margaret let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For the first time since she found him, he was choosing to survive. She watched as he lapped up the broth slowly, his body still shaking, but his eyes more alert than before. When he finally finished, he lifted his head and looked straight at her. Margaret felt a strange sense of understanding pass between them. She wasn't just saving him. He had already started saving her too. Margaret sat back in her chair, her eyes never leaving the German shepherd. He was awake, eating, and watching her, but there was still something haunted in his gaze. A deep-rooted pain that went beyond just the physical scars on his body. This was not just any dog. This was a dog who had been trained, disciplined, and had once belonged somewhere, before being thrown away. She could feel it. She needed answers. Margaret stood up slowly, her old bones aching, as she made her way to the small wooden cabinet near the kitchen. She reached for her reading glasses and an old laptop covered in dust. She hardly used it anymore, but tonight, she would. The screen flickered to life as she sat back down. Benny hopped up onto the couch beside her, curling into a tiny ball, but the shepherd never took his eyes off her. Margaret opened a search tab and typed the words carefully. Missing canine dogs in the area. She had no idea what she was looking for. No name, no identification. But if this shepherd had ever been part of a unit, part of something bigger, someone had to have noticed his absence. Scrolling through the pages, she came across several reports of stolen or missing police dogs. Her stomach tightened. Was he one of them? Margaret hesitated before clicking a different search. How to check for a microchip in a dog? She knew most police canines were microchipped. If she could find a way to check, she might be able to track down who he belonged to, or who had abandoned him. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard when she felt a heavy weight press against her knee. She looked down. The shepherd had moved closer, resting his head against her leg, his deep brown eyes searching hers. Margaret's throat tightened. "You belonged to someone, didn't you?" she whispered, brushing her fingers lightly over his ear. The shepherd exhaled, closing his eyes for just a moment. Margaret let out a slow breath. If he had a microchip, the vet could scan it. But what if sending him back meant sending him somewhere bad? Somewhere that had tied him up in the woods and left him to freeze. Her chest ached at the thought. She reached for her phone, her fingers hovering over the vet's number. She hesitated, just for a moment, before dialing. The line rang. "Dr. Harris's clinic," a voice answered on the other end. "Dr. Harris, it's Margaret," she said quickly. I found a dog, a German shepherd. He's in bad shape." A brief silence. "A shepherd?" The vet's tone shifted. "Does he seem trained? Military, police?" Margaret hesitated. I think so." Dr. Harris exhaled. "There was a report about a missing one not too long ago. Some kind of retired canine. The owner said the dog was stolen from his property a few weeks ago." Margaret's grip on the phone tightened. Stolen? Her gaze flickered back to the shepherd. If this was the same dog, then someone had taken him, tortured him, tied him up in the freezing cold, and left him for dead. Her stomach churned. "I can bring him in tomorrow," she finally said. "Good," Dr. Harris said. "I'll check for a microchip. If it's the same dog, I'll contact the owner." Margaret hung up slowly. The shepherd was watching her again. as if he knew. She reached down, brushing a hand against his fur. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away. For the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted to know who he belonged to. Because if he had truly been stolen from a good home, then maybe he had someone out there who was searching for him. But if he had been abandoned on purpose, then she would never, never let him go. As she sat there stroking the shepherd's fur, her heart battled between what was right and what was safe. Because if he was taken once, what's stopping someone from trying again? Margaret barely slept that night. She sat in her rocking chair, listening to the slow, steady breathing of the German shepherd curled up on the blanket near the fire. Benny had nestled beside him, as if sensing that his new friend needed comfort. But Margaret's mind was restless. The vet had told her this could be a retired canine stolen weeks ago. If that was true, then someone had taken him, hurt him, abandoned him in the freezing wind, and left him to die. And if she returned him to his original owner, how could she be sure he wouldn't be mistreated again? She sighed, rubbing her temples. There was only one way to find out. Morning came too soon. The golden rays of sunrise spilled through the frosted windows, painting the small cabin in soft light. The shepherd stirred, his ears twitching before his eyes fluttered open, while Margaret smiled gently. "Good morning, sweetheart." The dog slowly lifted his head, blinking at her. His body was still weak, but he was alive. And that was enough for now. Getting him into the truck was no easy task. The shepherd tried to stand, but his legs were still unsteady. Margaret had to wrap a blanket around him and help lift him into the old seat. He let out a soft huff of protest, but he didn't fight her. He trusted her. The drive to Dr. Harris's clinic was quiet. Aside from Benny's excited yips from the passenger seat, Margaret kept glancing at the shepherd through the rearview mirror. He was watching the road, always alert, always scanning. Even weak, even after all he'd been through, he was still a soldier. They pulled into the small vet clinic, and Margaret carefully helped the shepherd out of the truck. Dr. Harris was already waiting at the entrance. A tall man in his 50s, with silver streaks in his dark hair and a kind but curious gaze. "Margaret," he greeted, his eyes immediately locking onto the shepherd. "So, this is the dog you found?" Margaret nodded. "He's been through hell, but he's strong." Dr. Harris crouched down, studying the shepherd carefully. The dog didn't growl, didn't react. He simply watched, assessing, waiting. "He's trained," Dr. Harris said, confirming what Margaret already knew. "You can see it in the way he holds himself, even now. He's not just any dog." Margaret swallowed hard. "You think he's the missing one?" Dr. Harris stood up. "Only one way to find out. Let's scan him for a microchip." Margaret followed him inside, her heart pounding. She had no idea what she wanted to hear. The shepherd lay calmly on the exam table, allowing Dr. Harris to scan him. A moment later, a beep sounded. Margaret's stomach tightened. Dr. Harris glanced at the screen, his expression unreadable. Then he looked at Margaret. "There's an owner registered," he said slowly. "His name is on file." Margaret's fingers clenched around her coat. "Who?" Dr. Harris hesitated. Margaret's pulse pounded. "Who does he belong to?" The vet sighed. "A man named Richard Langley." Margaret's blood ran cold. She knew that name. Everyone in town did. Langley was no hero. He was dangerous, ruthless, and if this dog had belonged to him, Margaret suddenly knew exactly why someone had left him tied up in the woods to die. The shepherd wasn't just abandoned. Someone had tried to save him. Margaret felt the world tilt slightly as the name settled in her mind. Richard Langley, a man whose reputation preceded him, known not just in their small town, but beyond. He had money, power, and a history of cruelty that most people were too afraid to challenge. And now she knew. The dog she had risked her own life to save had once belonged to him. Dr. Harris sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. Margaret, if Langley finds out you have his dog, this could get dangerous. She looked down at the German Shepherd, at Odin. She didn't know why, but the name fit. He had the soul of an old warrior, one who had fought battles no one would ever know about. Odin's deep brown eyes watched her, waiting, almost as if he was asking what she was going to do next. Margaret's jaw tightened. "I don't care whose name is on that record," she said firmly. "That man left him to die. He doesn't deserve him back." Dr. Harris hesitated. "Legally, that's not up to us. If Langley reports him stolen, he could come looking for him." Margaret lifted her chin. "Then let him try." The shepherd shifted beside her, as if sensing the tension. He let out a low breath, and for the first time since she found him, he pressed his head gently against her leg. Margaret's throat tightened. Dr. Harris exhaled heavily, glancing around the empty clinic. Then, lowering his voice, he said, "There's a way we could keep him off the radar." Margaret's gaze snapped to him. "How?" "If I erase his microchip from the system, Langley will have no way of proving he ever belonged to him." Margaret felt a flicker of hope, but also hesitation. "Wouldn't that be illegal?" Dr. Harris looked at the dog, then back at her. "You tell me, leaving him tied to a tree in a blizzard to die, is that legal?" Margaret didn't hesitate. "Do it." Dr. Harris nodded. He turned back to the computer, his fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. The beep of the scanner sounded again as he adjusted the records. A moment later, he exhaled and looked back at her. "It's done." Odin was free. Margaret reached down, stroking the shepherd's thick fur. He wasn't just a survivor. He was hers now. Now Dr. Harris closed the file on his screen, his expression serious. "Be careful, Margaret. If Langley ever comes looking." Margaret met his glint, her voice steady. "I'll be ready." Odin lifted his head, watching her closely. Margaret knew, deep down, that this wasn't the end of the fight. It was just the beginning. Margaret drove home with Odin curled up in the back seat, his body still weak, but his eyes more alert than before. The quiet hum of the old truck was the only sound as she navigated the snowy roads back to her cabin. She kept glancing at him through the rearview mirror, wondering if he had any idea what had just happened. Odin was no longer a nameless, forgotten soul left to die in the cold. He was free, at least on paper. But in reality, Margaret knew that Richard Langley was not the type of man to forget something he considered his. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened. She had never feared much in her life, even after losing her husband years ago. But Langley was dangerous, and she wasn't naive enough to believe this was over. If he ever found out she had Odin, he would come looking. Benny, her little terrier, sat in the passenger seat, his head tilting toward Odin, as if sensing something unspoken between them. Benny had taken to Odin quickly, which was rare for the little dog. Maybe Benny knew what Margaret had already figured out. Odin belonged here now. As she pulled up to the cabin, the winter sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the snow-covered trees. She stepped out, walked around to the passenger side, and opened the door carefully. "Come on, sweetheart," she said softly. Odin hesitated for a moment before slowly moving, stepping onto the ground with deliberate caution. His legs were still weak, but he was standing better now, stronger. Margaret placed a steadying hand on his back, feeling the warmth of his fur beneath her fingertips. "One step at a time," she murmured. Odin looked at her then, really looked at her. It wasn't just gratitude in his eyes. It was understanding. Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat. "You're home now." She led him inside, and Benny excitedly ran in circles around them, his tail wagging wildly. Margaret set down fresh bowls of water and food. watching as Odin sniffed them cautiously before taking his first bite. It was slow, careful, as if he wasn't used to being able to eat without fear. Margaret felt her heart ache at the thought. What had Langley done to him? She settled into her rocking chair, watching him from across the room. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls. Odin ate a little, then lay down with a heavy sigh, his massive body sinking into the old blanket near the fire. Benny curled up beside him, small but protective. Margaret reached for her cup of tea, blowing on it before taking a sip. She had so many questions. Why had Langley left Odin to die? Had someone tried to help him escape? Or had Langley simply discarded him like broken equipment? Her thoughts were interrupted by a noise outside. A car engine, distant but approaching. Margaret's pulse quickened. No one ever came out here unless they had a reason. She carefully set down her tea, rising from her chair just as Odin lifted his head, ears pricked forward. He heard it too. A dark sedan appeared at the end of her long, snow-covered driveway. It stopped near the fence, the engine idling. Margaret felt her stomach twist. A man stepped out, dressed in a dark coat, his movements slow, calculated. Even from this distance, she recognized him. Richard Langley. Odin stiffened, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Margaret's heart pounded. She had known this was a possibility, but she hadn't expected it so soon. Langley walked toward the porch, stopping at the bottom of the steps. He took off his gloves, clapping them together once before slipping them into his pocket. "Evening, Margaret," he said, his voice smooth but edged with something dangerous. She didn't move from the doorway. "What do you want, Richard?" Langley smirked. "Just checking in. Heard through the grapevine that you picked up a stray." Margaret's fingers curled into fists. "Plenty of strays around this time of year." Langley took a step forward, his boots crunching in the snow. "Not like this one. You see, I had a dog go missing recently." His eyes flickered toward the window, where Odin's silhouette was barely visible in the firelight. A big German shepherd, trained, worth quite a bit. Margaret didn't blink. "Seems to me if he was worth so much, you wouldn't have left him tied to a tree in a blizzard." Langley's smirk faltered, but only for a second. "That's a bold accusation," he said smoothly. Margaret crossed her arms. "It's not an accusation, it's the truth." Langley's expression hardened. "Let's cut to the chase, Margaret. I know you have him, and I know you and that vet of yours erased his chip. You think that makes him yours?" Margaret's voice was steady. "I don't think, Richard. I know." Silence stretched between them. Odin's growl deepened, his massive frame shifting behind her like a shadow ready to strike. Langley exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "You're making a mistake." Margaret didn't flinch. "So are you. If you so much as step 1 foot onto my land again, I'll make sure every single person in town knows exactly what you did." Langley's lips pressed into a thin line. "You've got guts for an old woman," he muttered. Margaret smiled coldly. "And you've got nothing left to threaten me with." Langley stared at her for a long moment. Then, with a slow nod, he stepped back. "You think you won this," he said. "But you don't know me as well as you think." Margaret's voice was calm but firm. "And you don't know me at all." Langley turned, walking back to his car. He didn't slam the door, didn't speed away. He simply drove off, disappearing into the night. Margaret stood there for a long time, watching the snow settle over the empty road. She knew this wasn't over. But as she stepped back inside, locking the door behind her, she knew one thing for sure. Odin was safe, and no matter what happened next, she would never let anyone hurt him again. Odin stepped toward her, his massive head nudging against her hand. She stroked his fur, her voice steady but soft. "We're not afraid of him," she murmured. "Not now, not ever." Odin let out a deep, steady breath. and for the first time since she found him, he looked at peace. Margaret knew there would be more fights ahead, but tonight, they had won. Margaret knew that Langley wouldn't let this go. Men like him never did. But as the days passed, no one came knocking on her door. The snow thickened, the air grew colder, and Odin grew stronger. At first, he struggled to move, his muscles stiff from weeks of starvation and exposure. But soon, he was walking beside her on their morning path, his steps slow but steady. Benny followed close behind, yipping excitedly, as if urging Odin to keep up. One afternoon, Margaret sat by the fire, watching as Odin curled up beside Benny on the rug. His ears twitched when she spoke. "You were meant for more than suffering, sweetheart," she murmured. "You were meant to be loved." Odin sighed, resting his head on his paws. For the first time, he looked truly at home. Margaret knew that, no matter what happened, she had made the right choice. Odin was hers now, and no one, not even Richard Langley, would ever take him away again.